Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. Today we are capturing some flowing water. For that, I'd like to welcome Mahesh Thapa back to the platform. A huge thank you to Sony, obviously, for hosting today's event. Mahesh, what's going on?
Nothing much, Eric. Great to be back.
Well, it's good to have
Talking
you.
about
Good
one
afternoon.
of my
Welcome
favorite
back to the
subjects.
B&H event space. Today we are
I
capturing
love
some
it.
flowing
Well, I'm going to
water.
turn it over to
For
you. I'll
that, I'd like
remind
to welcome.
everybody.
That if you do have any questions at all, feel
Is
free to
anybody
drop
hearing
them into the
a
YouTube chat.
feedback?
I think you had a little loopback going on there. I heard it cut out though, so
Okay, cut. Okay, perfect.
I
Great.
think
Thank
we
you.
should be good now. There we go.
We're good.
See,
Thanks, guys.
Mahesh, we've recently hired Mahesh as our associate producer, so we want to thank him for chiming on that.
Super. Chat messages.
All right, Mahesh, I'll get out of your way. I'll let you do your thing, and we'll see you in a bit from Q&A.
Thanks, guys. All right. When I first started this, I was like, well, let's talk about waterfall photography. But then I realized, it's not everything that flow is a waterfall. So I call it water flow photography because, we could then expand our talk to rivers and streams and lakes, long exposure photography, things like that. That's the good stuff. So hopefully what I talk about today, you can apply to anything that has movement, whether it's streaks of light, whether it's clouds, whether it's water. And a lot of the concepts we talk about is going to be very, very similar. But I am going to concentrate mainly on flowing water for this particular talk. Um, so full disclosure, I am a Sony Alpha Collective member, so I am a ambassador for Sony, and all images that you see here were taken with some kind of a Sony camera and lens system, whether it's full frame, APS-C, point and shoot, or even the smartphone like the Xperia. So I have a couple of shots from there. So so when I run workshops, I do a few of them for particularly just for waterfalls, like for example, waterfalls of the Columbia River Gorge. Uh, and this is what I sort of tell my students. Photographing flowing water is easy. Capturing its beauty is extremely difficult. The technical aspects of waterfall photography, it doesn't take a long time to learn. Once you sort of get that down you're going to be a pro in no time. But then it's sort of going beyond that to find unique compositions, uh, different perspectives, varying the shutter speeds to get various textures to the water, things like that. That takes a little bit more time to master. And hopefully, I can convey some of that information to you guys today, in addition to the technical factors. Uh, In essence, we're talking about long exposure photography for the most part when we're capturing, whether you're capturing something for a half a second, 1 second, or 2 hours, the concepts behind how you do that is not going to change. You need a tripod. You need to be able to have deal with noise reduction. You need to somehow control your aperture and the light that's getting into your system. So whatever I talk about today can be applied to really any type of long exposure photography. And if you are a landscape and nature photographer, this is sort of your bread and butter, if you will. Uh, we're gonna talk about the use of gear, the how to use it properly, the techniques that you need to employ. But also, as we sort of talk about things, you need to be aware that you're around water, and water and electronics, no matter how weather sealed your system may be, they don't get along very well. Particularly if the waterfalls, even if it's not raining, you have a lot of spray that comes along and hits your equipment. So you need to learn to, one, protect yourself because oftentimes you're hiking in these places, slippery rocks, puddles, depths where you may not appreciate how deep water is, flowing water, that's the currents, things like that. So you really need to protect yourself and your gear. Another concept I want to put out there is, as you start out, you need to take lots and lots of images because even if you have the tripod at the same place, taking the same scene, it's flowing water. Every pattern that's generated is different. Every shutter speed that you use is going to generate something a little different. So I say, it's very hard to predict exactly what image you're going to take when you press a shutter. So be comfortable with the fact that you will be taking lots and lots of images, varying your composition, even minutely, maybe moving the camera up or down or tripod left or right, rotating it. Even little movements like that end up having a big impact on the photography that you eventually end up with. And finally, this is all about having fun. Nobody goes to catch a waterfall and say, "Oh, another chore. I have to go on a hike and capture another waterfall." It should be a fun activity. So the process of capturing them should also be fun. Let's talk a little bit about the gear, and I'll tell you the gear that I use. But for the most part, what gear you use doesn't really matter. We're not talking about wildlife photography where you need huge lenses, expensive, fast lenses. We're not talking about needing many megapixels or whatever. This is something you can take your time with and really get to know the situation, get to know your settings, and take the pictures. So this is my current setup, just because this is what I happen to use. Sony's just generous, and I really like this equipment. It's weather sealed, everything I talk about over here, so that's another plus. And the quality of the lenses and the sensor is great. So I use a Sony a7R5. It's a 60 megapixel sensor. I particularly like this because I can crop and still have quite a few megapixels to work with. The dynamic range is really second to none, particularly at the very low ISO values. I mean, this camera was built for high dynamic range at low ISO settings. It's not as great as some other cameras that Sony makes at very high ISO settings, but at very low ISO settings, this is great. And I'm almost shooting it at the base ISO when I'm shooting water flow. I've recently switched over to the 16 to 25 millimeter f2.8 G lens, and hopefully somebody out there is putting links to this equipment as I talk about it if you're interested. I used to use the 16 to 35 f4 lens, and that's because I'm not typically shooting at f2.8. And the 16-35 f2.8 was just a little bit too heavy, but the new 16-25 f2.8 G lens, the 2.8 16-35 was a G master lens, so quality was quote unquote better, but I haven't really noticed a big difference. This 16-25 2.8 is lighter, smaller, still affords great weather sealing, and it's now 2.8. I used to carry f4. But now I don't have to carry a separate lens if I also happen to want to do some low light photography, such as astrophotography. This sort of serves dual purposes for me now, both as an ultra wide astrophotography lens and as a great ultra wide lens in general. And and there's less overlap with my favorite lens, which is the 24 to 105 f4G. So between 24 and 25, there's only 1 millimeter of overlap as opposed to the 16-35, where I feel like I'm carrying extra focal length weight without any benefit. So the 24, again, I don't mind that being f4 because, like I said, most of my really low light photography is done at the ultra wide angle range anyway, and a lot of my sort of medium and medium telephoto or zoom telephoto is going to be in the 24 to 105 or the 100 to 400, in which case I'm always on a tripod. I don't really care about needing a very fast lens. So as my basic hiking setup for when I go waterfall photography or water flow photography, this is what I typically take. You could take an APS-C system, whatever, for get some equivalent lenses. But at the very least, I think you should have something covering at least to about the 100 to 200 millimeter range. You could get a sort of 16 to 25, 24 to 105, and the 70 to 200 f4 lens. That's also a very, very good lens that has a macro capability that this lens doesn't, but it doesn't reach quite as much. But it is lighter and smaller. So it all depends on how much zoom you need. For a lot of people, 200 millimeters is enough, but I typically carry the 100 to 400 now because sometimes I like to get some intimate scenes from way back where I happen to be standing. Two other things that I always carry as far as something to control the light. One is a polarizer, and the other is an ND filter. Oftentimes, it's a set of ND filters, typically carrying a 3-stop, a 6-stop, and 10-stop. And that's because I want to be able to control the amount of light and the shutter speed, because I want to be able to vary the shutter speed as I wish to capture a certain texture in the water, for example. Now, a lot of people out there say, well, what about these variable ND filters? The newer variable ND filters are actually getting much better. The older ones, where they're a little bit too ambitious in their range, like there's like a 2-stop to 10-stop variable ND filters, they ended up being not as good, because essentially a variable ND filter is just two polarizers stacked on top of each other, and then they're using the properties of polarizers as it inhibits light from certain angles to coming in. So if you inhibit light from two different angles, then you make the image darker. But because of the way polarizers work, you often would get patchy areas of exposure, like one area being too bright, one area being too dark. When they combine these variable aperture or variable ND filters. But now some companies, for example, Nisi makes this variable ND filter, but they're not as aggressive. It's only from 1 to 4 stops, and another one going from 4 to 8 stops. So when you're a little less ambitious, aggressive about how much ND stoppage you offer on a variable aperture lens, it ends up being better. It's not 100%, but definitely much better than trying to go for those huge variable ND filters that range from 2 stops to 10 stops. But if you want to avoid any artifact altogether, just get dedicated ND filters at the stops you need. And I like the 3 to 6 to 10 stop, because from between 3 and 6, 4 and 5, I can achieve that with my aperture setting or my ISO setting if I need that granularity in the degree of light that's coming in. Same between 6 and 10 stops. These are good approximations. And the polarizer itself, remember, has ND properties. Oftentimes, polarizers will stop 1.5 to 2 stops of light from hitting a sensor. So the fact that you have a polarizer already has an ND filter, albeit a small ND filter built in. Companies are also making now ND filters with a built-in polarizer, so which is actually, I think, pretty awesome. So you can get a 3-stop ND polarizer filter or a 6-stop ND polarizer filter. I'm not sure they make a 10-stop ND polarizer filter. I have at least I haven't seen one. But if you know you're always going to be using a polarizer, for example, if you want to take glare off the surfaces of bright things like leaves and water, so you can get a little bit more contrast. In addition to an ND filter, if you know you're going to be doing that a lot, probably best to get one of those. But if you want to just stick to a single polarizer that you can then attach to an ND filter, then get a separate polarizer and a separate set of ND filters. 3-stop, 6-stop, 10-stop is sort of my go-to system. And I typically just use the circular ones. I know that there are systems where you have these square filters or quadrilateral filters, rectangular filters that you drop in on a big bulky system. I find that they are hard to clean because you're in this environment where it's very, very wet. It may be raining. There may be a lot of spray that's coming in, and oftentimes the liquid that gets on your system will be not just on the surface, at the front surface of the filter, but it'll make its way to the back of the filter because there's a gap between your lens and your filter. So you may be able to clean off the front, but you won't be able to get to the back. And by the time you get to the back, the front will get wet again. So for water flow photography, where there's going to be a lot of spray, a lot of rain type system, just go with the circular filter. It's going to save you a lot of heartache and angst as you capture these images. Just as an idea of sorry, doorbell's ringing. Sorry. Each stop of light, basically, each stop of an ND filter stops 50% of the light from hitting the sensor. So, for example, let's say you had no filter on your lens and you set up your shot, you chose the correct aperture that you wanted, you had the ISO, and it says, oh, in order to get the proper exposure, it's going to take 1 second, right? You put a 1-stop filter on, It changes nothing. It has no effect on this ISO, has no effect on the aperture. It just stops 50% of the light from getting in, which means now that you have to increase your shutter speed to 2 seconds in order to maintain the same level of overall brightness in your image. A two-stop filter means that now you have to expose the shot for 4 seconds and so on and so forth. So that's the basic concept of an ND filter. And that's why it becomes so powerful because it lets you maintain your depth of field, your noise level, and only thing you're affecting really is your shutter speed. A great investment. In fact, I'd rather leave a lens behind or something than not carry a tripod. And you need something that's relatively sturdy. So it's hard to recommend a travel tripod for water flow photography because oftentimes you have the tripod in the water, and you may actually be in the water with the tripod itself. And when the water is flowing, the very lightweight or less sturdy tripods are not going to be able to keep uh, it'll be soft. Your image is really soft because there's so much motion and so much vibration. So my current favorite is this tripod by Vanguard. It's called the VO3. And the reason I like it is because of this one particular feature right here. I'm not a big fan of center columns, but they've made a slightly different variation where you can actually make the center column and put it in a horizontal position, turn it all the way down, however you want it. And it lets me uh, get my camera such that in unique positions. And it also allows me to put a second camera, should I wish, over here. So oftentimes what I'll do in workshops is I will have one camera where I'm taking the pictures, another camera that has maybe just for video or a GoPro or something that's just capturing what I'm doing, and I can have my hands free to do what I need. So I really like this feature of this particular tripod, and it is carbon fiber. So even though it's sturdy, it's not super heavy, and you can carry it around without problems. And it's great to put in water because of the carbon fiber and the way it's built. It really is great. So I've been using it for a year now, and then this is my favorite. There are other tripods that you can try. If you already have a great tripod, that's fine, but just make sure that it's a sturdy tripod because um, this is one of the situations where a good tripod is really going to help you. I also suggest that you get a wireless remote control for your camera, uh, because you're gonna have to find a way to press the shutter speed without moving the camera. You can use the timer, that's fine. In other words, there's a timer on the camera, you press the shutter speed, it waits a variable amount of time before it actuates the frame. So let's say 2 seconds, or 5 seconds, 10 seconds. But oftentimes, you're capturing flowing water and you may see a pattern that you like. So if you have a timer and you press the shutter speed, you're going to have to wait that amount of time before the shutter is actually taken deployed and the image is taken. So you may lose that particular pattern that you're looking for. And so why not a wired remote? Again, you're going to be in very inclement conditions. It's going to be wet. And no matter how good your weather system, seal system is, when you take that flap down to expose your little outlet for your wired remote control, it's no longer weather sealed, right? But if you have a wireless one, it takes care of both problems. As soon as you press the shutter button, it takes the picture. You don't have to open up any flaps, so you're not gonna get water into your system. And I like the Bluetooth system a little bit more over the IR system because I can be a little further away from the camera. I don't have to be line of sight. And I find the Bluetooth to be a little bit more reliable than infrared remote controls. For my Sony system, this is the one I use. It's called the RMT P1BT. That's a terrible name, but it's a wireless remote commander, and it does exactly what I don't really use any of the other functions like zooming. If you had a lens that allow you to zoom, it'll do that. I just use it for the button here to release the shutter. Uh, Realize that, you know, some of your best compositions are not going to be from the side of the stream or at the edge of the waterfall. It's going to be you having to go in the stream and capturing some compelling shots. It lets you get very close to the white part of the water, for example. It lets you look up in a perspective that you often don't get. And so oftentimes you'll want to go inside the stream with your equipment. So all the more reason to make sure that you protect yourself and your gear. So typically, I just have in the summertime, especially, I just have some water shoes in my backpack. And so when I know I have to go in, I have shorts on, or maybe I have a change of shorts in my bag, I just put those on and I just go up to my knees or up to my mid thighs. So I'm still at least in the water. Maybe I won't be able to get in as deep as if I had waders on. But if I know I'm going for a particular type of shot in a particular area, and I've been there before, and I know I have to go deep into the stream, I will carry neoprene booties with dedicated water shoes and waders. Oftentimes, you can see me here with the with the waders on, often to the level of your chest. And a lot of these waders have little protected pockets in your chest. This is basically what fishermen use, right? And you could put in your phone there, extra set of filters that you may want to use. I find those to be very, very helpful. And it's actually because oftentimes it's almost sort of like a wetsuit also, so you stay warm in the water when you have these waders on. Some other things that you may not think about, but I recommend carrying and it's all about dealing with the water spray, dealing with inclement weather, dealing with the waves and the splashes that come through, salt water, things like that. So I actually carry an umbrella with me. It's not one of those cheap umbrellas. It doesn't have to be super heavy, but enough to protect your gear. And it's not so much for the protection, more so than the convenience. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll compose my shot of a water flow or a waterfall or stream. But as I compose a shot, little droplets of water are falling on the front of my lens or the front of my filter. Uh, Now, if I just try to wipe it and take a picture, uh, as soon as I'm done wiping, and by the time I wipe and I press the shutter button on my remote release, water has already gotten on the front of my front of my lens. So what I do is I compose the shot and I put an umbrella between the water and the lens, and then I make all my settings, ISO, whatever you, and as soon as I lift my umbrella up, I press the shutter button so that minimizes the time between, when the lens is being protected by the umbrella and the umbrella is taken away. So you have very few water droplets. And even with that, you may not be able to avoid water droplets altogether. And then what I do is I take several shots. So I use the umbrella, take a shot after umbrella, and I take another shot, same technique. The benefit of that is the water droplets will be at different places between the shots. So what you can then do is, because you're on a tripod, you could take those images into Photoshop and clone out the water droplet from one spot with the with the clean area from the other spot as you layer those images. So as you can imagine, but that's what you're doing. Without you having to resort to clone, you just mask out each of these water spots because you've taken multiple shots from the same location and you've wiped the lens between shots. So anyway, I think you get the concept. I take big absorbent towels with me, and these are like these automotive towels you get at Costco, kind of like chamois almost. The little tiny things that you get for free at a convention or something that's good for your glasses is not what's going to be good enough for your gear, because it's not just the front element that you're cleaning. You're wiping down your whole camera oftentimes because it's going to get wet. So, and these are cheap. It's like $15 for 30 of them or something like that. You A very simple hack is, when I travel, I always take these little shower caps with me. They're great because they have elastic band at the end. You could put it all the way around your camera and have just the little lens part or the filter part exposed. And they work great actually as a great hack to protect your equipment. Or you can buy dedicated what they call shells. Peak Design makes one. I think ThinkTech also makes one. It sort of looks like this. It's a more robust system, but they're not cheap. You can often get away with just these little shower caps if you want to. And for this is another example of a waterfall shot. I was actually in the stream, walking to get this particular perspective. Because had I tried to shoot this waterfall, this part of it was not visible from any part of the stream. So actually, only after going into the stream was this little part actually even visible. So maybe a little thing, but compositionally, I think it flows better. Uh, right. So what do you do with your gear once it's packed away? It's good to have uh, a good quality camera bag, particularly one that has a rain cover, or if it doesn't have a rain cover, buy a rain cover, because you're often and put the rain cover on before you get to the waterfall. Because some people, so they just leave it like, oh, it's not raining, I don't need a rain cover. But all of a sudden you'll get to the waterfall and you'll turn the corner and this rush of water or this rush of mist will hit you. So just make sure you already have the rain cover on before you get to your destination. The one I'm using currently is again by Vanguard. It's called the Alta Sky 51D. And it has plenty of room for all my equipment. It's protected well. It comes with a rain guard, and it's relatively inexpensive actually. So it's one of the less expensive, good quality backpacks out there. So a few tips about camera settings, and again, a lot of this depends on what your personal preference is. Some people love the smooth, almost shaving cream texture to the water that comes with very long exposures. Other people like the sort of droplet, high shutter speed, like stop motion type of image. And some people like something in between. So, take a few of each type of shot and then see what appeals to you. And what appeals to you for one particular area or shot may be different than some other location or some other waterfall. So again, what do you prefer a crisp droplets of water? Do you like that silky smooth appearance? For me, I like it somewhere in between. And as I started out, I discovered my favorite shutter speeds were between a half a second and 2 seconds. And a lot of it actually will depend on how close you are to the waterfall. If you're like inches away, you may want a slightly uh, faster shutter speed so you can capture the motion without it immediately blurring. But if the waterfall is super far away, whether you shoot that at 2 seconds or 1/10 of a second, there's not going to be enough detail for you to be able to make out that smoothness as well. So you can shoot those far away waterfalls with a slightly slower shutter speed and still not be able. In other words, you don't have necessarily to tripod or have long exposures to still get a very compelling shot of a waterfall that's far away. A lot more care needs to be taken, I guess, or thought needs to be applied if you're taking pictures of waterfalls or flowing water that's much closer to you or closer to the camera. Uh, so, almost everything I shoot in manual, but for waterfalls, I like the aperture priority mode a lot. You've got this great expensive camera system. Let it do some of the thinking for you. You know, there's very little reason to shoot completely in manual mode if you don't have to. I like aperture priority because that way it lets me concentrate on what depth of field I want as far as the aperture that I need to do that. And I'm going to set the shut ISO to make it as low as possible. And then I'm going to let the camera decide what the shutter speed should be to get the proper exposure. But then I control that shutter speed not necessarily by changing my aperture or ISO anymore, but more so by using ND filters and polarizers. That's where that part, the art of this sort of comes into play, I think. I also say that, I typically shoot between f8 and f11 because, I really want something with a lot of depth of field. I try to avoid f16 or f22 because that's going to introduce a lot of diffraction. So meaning that the overall image is going to be very, very soft. And I try to explain to somebody what it means to have diffraction associated with softness. I sort of think about I wear glasses, and if I don't have my glasses on, I can't see anything very well. But if I squint my eyes like this, I can make out things because everything gets a little bit sharper, but at the expense of everything getting sort of diffusely hazy and soft. So that's what happens with these apertures that are very, very narrow. It can increase your depth of field so everything appears from front to back a little bit sharper, but at the expense of an overall haziness because so much light is coming, or so little light is coming through such a narrow opening. And so I think if people who wear glasses can, I think, appreciate that analogy. Um, Typically, I start at the lowest native ISO, which on most cameras is ISO 100. Uh, Remember, the lowest ISO, native ISO, has the most dynamic range. So if your native ISO is 100, that's going to have more dynamic range than ISO 200, 400, 800, right? Even if you're considering these dual gain sensors, still the native lowest ISO is going to have a higher dynamic range than the dual gain sensor versus the ISO 600 or 800. That's the second um, um, position of the native ISO. The lowest native ISO is where you want to be at if you can. And then I use ND and polarize to achieve the appropriate speed. And that's sort of like the theme that I want you to take home is that nowhere else in photography are these ND filters, I think, more helpful than in capturing water flow photography. So why do I say the lowest native ISO? Because you'll often have ISOs that are extended. So you can, let's say your native ISO is 100, but some cameras say, oh, but you can extend it all the way down to ISO 25. So we go, oh, if native ISO is 100, if I go to ISO 25, I can get even slower shutter speeds, which is true. But you're sacrificing dynamic range when you do that, right? There's no free lunch. For example, this is essentially what's happening. The camera is taking, let's say you're shooting at an ISO of 50. The camera is actually still shooting it at ISO 100, but prolonging the exposure for twice as long. So let's say at native ISO, your exposure time was 1 second. When you switch it to ISO 50, it's taking it for 2 seconds, but the camera is still shooting it at ISO 100. You just get an overexposed image. So you lose a lot of dynamic range in the highlights, the very bright areas. You get more dynamic range in the shadows because the shadows are being exposed for a longer period of time, but you're sacrificing highlight data. So that's why I say shoot at the lowest native ISO and don't go to the extended ranges. Uh, and I say to my beginner photographers, I say, use the custom dials. So if you know you're going to be doing a lot of varied types of photography, have a dial that's dedicated for your water flow. So for example, if you know you're always going to start out initially at an ISO 100, aperture priority, f8 or f11, whatever f you want to do, set that. That way, if you're taking pictures something else, maybe wildlife or your kids, and you want to quickly get to your water flow settings, move the dial to a custom setting 1, 2, or 3, or whatever have you, and you're set. And at that point, there's less mental angst as you start out, or there's less of a cognitive load on your system as you're sort of getting everything ready, and the rain is falling on you, and then you're on a slippery surface. Let the modern gear help you to achieve what you need to achieve. I also encourage people to use the histogram because oftentimes you're shooting in these situations where things are kind of dark. Maybe there's a split between the sky and the foreground, where the sky is very bright and the foreground is very dark, and the camera is gonna exposure system may get a little bit confused. But if you have a histogram, you can see exactly what the distribution of the colors distribution of the light is. So if you have an image where the histogram is all the way towards the left, you may have to just overexpose that a little bit more, or if everything is bunched up to the right, you may have to underexpose that a little bit more. It just gives you a little bit of more information, particularly when you're outside and the LCD is washed out, or your viewfinder may not be as accurate. What is accurate, always completely accurate, is going to be your histogram. So trust the histogram, don't trust the LCD. So what I want to sort of end with is an example, just to make sure you get you got the concepts right. So pretend you're set up your tripod, you're taking a picture of a waterfall, and this is your starter point, and you say, okay, I'm consciously going to choose to shoot this in aperture priority mode. I'm going to set my aperture at f8. I'm going to set my native lowest ISO at ISO 100. And when I do that, the camera tells me to get a proper exposure. My shutter speed should be 1/8 of a second to achieve the proper brightness, right? But you said, well, Mahesh said, and I want to sort of start out see what if his settings are good. I want to achieve a shutter speed of 1 second, right? Because I want a slightly smoother appearance to the water flow. I've got a tripod. I can spend as much time as I want here to take a long exposure that I want. I want to achieve an exposure shutter speed of 1 second. What do I do? Well, you have several ways of doing that, right? One, while you're shooting at f8, so going from 1/8 of a second to 1 second, how many stops of light is that? So if you double the exposure time, that's 2/8 of a second or 1/4. If you double that, it's 1/2. If you double that, it's 1 second. So to go from 1/8 of a second to 1 second, it's 3 stops of light, right? So 3 stops of light. So f8, one stop of light from f8 would be f11. Another stop would be f16. Another stop would be f22. So conceptually, you could just change your aperture to f22 and get that 1 second shutter speed, right? However, remember we talked about if you shoot beyond f16 or so, or f16 or more, you're going to get this diffraction associated with softness. So you're going to have an image, that's going to be 1 second, but everything's going to be kind of blurry and soft because of all the diffraction. In addition, you already, wanted a depth of field of f8. Maybe you don't want the depth of field of an f22. Maybe you want some things to be a little bit out of focus, right? So you want that f8 aperture. Going to f22 is going to mess up your depth of field that you've chosen. So no, don't shoot at f22. Okay. Another way to get these 3 stops of light back is, okay, what if I drop down my ISO to the extended value of 25? Well, if I go from 100 to a 50, that's 1 stop. 50 to 25, that's 2 stops. And now I'll just change the aperture to f11 to get me to 3 stops. That still gets me to 3 stops. It allows me to achieve a shutter speed of 1 second. But no, you don't want to do that because remember, the best ISO that you want to use is not the extended ISO because you're going to lose dynamic range the further down the extended range that you go. And plus, you're going to have to change your aperture and choose a depth of field that you weren't initially wanting to choose, right? You're making some kind of compromise. The best option is to do an ND filter. Use a 3-step ND filter. So putting a 3-step ND filter allows you to maintain ISO 100, aperture f8. So it takes your shutter speed from 1/8 of a second to 1 second. It only affects the shutter speed at that point. And boom, you've got your perfectly exposed shot, at the aperture you wanted, at the native ISO, so there's no noise, best dynamic range, and you've achieved your shutter speed of 1 second. So hopefully that makes sense. And so, maybe rewind this part of the conversation if it doesn't. And also, you're welcome to send me questions if you like. And with that, I will open it up for questions and comments.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mahesh. You just pointed out that I've been doing something wrong, so thank you.
What was that?
I was on the list. The extended ISO. I don't. All right, for everyone like me, let's make this a teachable moment for everyone else like me. I'll take the hit for all the people out here who have possibly done the same thing. Don't have a neutral density filter. And the reason being, I'm all over the place with lenses. What is the best system that you recommend for the person who has various lenses of various diameters, but you have to have a neutral? I mean, especially now with video, not just waterfall and water flow. With video now, you have to have a neutral density filter to do video outside during the day. It's a must. Yeah. So what is the system that you recommend is the easiest, most versatile filtering system or neutral density filter?
So, so the answer is slightly different depending on what. So if you're mainly a video shooter, I think variable ND is still great because the reason is because, you know, video is just a bunch of still images shot at a very high shutter rate, right? And so when you do that, and as you're panning, you don't see those artifacts as much. It's when you have a still image and you're doing a long exposure, where the light is hitting the sensor consistently for a long time and from one spot that you notice these artifacts. Variable ND filters for video is still amazing because it's so convenient.
Okay.
So I have no issues for video with the variability field. It's when you get to these long exposure photography that and you try to put like a very aggressive variable ND filter on your system where you go from two stop to 10 spot with a turn that you're gonna have these patches of artifacts. So for those, either go with a variable ND system that's not as aggressive. So maybe two variable ND filters, one that goes from just 1 to 4 or 5 stops, another one that goes from 5 stops to 10 stops. Maybe you could do that. And then get the biggest diameter that you can find for your biggest lens, and then get step-up rings. So that way you're not spending buying a complete set of ND filters or variable ND filters for each lens that you have that has a different diameter.
Okay. We just had Autumn Shock on, and she mentioned the same thing. And I'm going to take this as two Sony ambassadors telling me the same thing in a week. I think it's time for me to get that filter with some step up rings. I got to finally listen to you guys, so I don't
And,
have
and,
to.
and, you know, and I don't want to discourage people from using the extended ISO, but just know the limitations.
Hmm.
Know what you're sacrificing when you use an extended ISO. And that's the concept, right? It's like, so why not, if I want to achieve the lowest noise, why am I shooting at ISO 100 when I can shoot at ISO 50 and get half the noise? But you're getting half the noise not because you're shooting at ISO 50, you're actually still shooting at ISO 100, but you're shooting it for twice as long. So you have more photons in the shadow and dark areas to get rid of the noise, but you have too many photons in the very bright areas, so you lose the dynamic range there. So you lose dynamic range while getting in the highlights while gaining more dynamic range in the shadows. But that as long as you're okay with that compromise, then fine. Just make the conscious decision and just don't blindly use it.
I love that. That's why they pay him the big bucks. Move to a question. Billy Gray over in the YouTube asking if the dedicated remote offers an advantage over using a phone app such as Sony Imaging Edge Mobile.
Yes, definitely. I like the Sony app, but you have to get your phone out. Okay, you may drop it in the water when that happens. So a pro tip on my remote control, I actually have a little styrofoam thing on the back of it because I have dropped the remote control in the water and it has gotten lost. But with that little styrofoam, it'll always float to the top. So, and the Sony app, it doesn't reach as far, I've noticed, as the dedicated Bluetooth remote control. Like a Sony, I can only walk a certain distance before I lose signal. But the dedicated Bluetooth remote I can go a much bigger distance. So if I want myself in the picture, for example, I can walk a further distance and I can use that. Uh, and the biggest thing is I don't have to take my phone out and in these environments where I can drop it somewhere.
Mm. I love that styrofoam tip. I think that's the winner of the
Yeah.
day right there.
Yeah. Look, glue and styrofoam, it's so cheap, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. It's like, why wouldn't you think of that? That's great. I'm gonna make one for my camera so I can take my camera on the water.
Yeah.
Cheaper than a housing. All right, let's not stretch it there. Let's not stretch it. But Mahesh, always great to have you on. That wraps it up for the questions. Easy session, just some
Oh,
good
great.
information here as always. Looking forward to the next time we have you on. I want to thank Mahesh, of course, Sony for hosting today's event, and all of our viewers, as always, for tuning in. Another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space now in the books. Catch y'all next time.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Sony. Appreciate it. Thanks, B&H. Derek, Fred, Hooper, everybody. Bye
Thank
now.
you, Mahesh.